How is it now? Can you hear me now? Is the sound back? Okay, we're on. So welcome to our study of Traleg Kyabgon, which is desire, why it matters. And yeah, you know, one very beautiful detail or aspect of all of particularly in the Mahayana tradition, and certainly my teachers would always emphasize this, and it's what we call preparing with bodhicitta. And it means that when we're undertaking this study, we're doing it recognizing its relevance for everyone everywhere. It's not just that we're doing some isolated Buddhist thing, but we're actually getting to the bottom of where suffering really originates from. So in that sense, the undertaking here has tremendous significance. So keeping that in mind is not so much about us thinking we're doing something special, but it's more just seeing what we're doing here has a purpose in terms of others, not just ourselves. And this inclusion of others in our motivation we call preparing the ground with bodhicitta. And it also is linked up with the practice that we have at the end, which is dedicating whatever good there is in this, we also give it away. So in this way, the study here that we're doing is not just for ourselves, but really with an understanding of the suffering in the world and very much directed towards the well-being of others. So, so with that motivation, then whatever we do actually has much larger significance. Okay. Now we're looking at the last section in the first part of the book, which is very much about dealing with desire, understanding desire and understanding the dynamics of desire. And what we're going to be looking at now in this section, going into the second part, is now we've understood that desire is much more than just desire as an isolated phenomenon. It's something that is, you could say, universally relevant in terms of our experience and everything that we undertake. So from that point of view, desire is really it's something really universal, but it's also indicative of the whole situation that we find ourselves in. And so once now we've understood that, then we're going to look more specifically at something called abhidharma, which is then further understanding the mechanisms of our mind. And again, I'd like to emphasize this is, despite there's some information that we're taking in, try and notice how Traleg Rinpoche's approach, which is very much like we find it in traditional Buddhist education, is very much coming back at the same theme, but from different angles. And that really skillfully enables us to completely actually grasp what this potentially complex issue is about. And yes, so this leads us then to really understanding the something that often is understood as something that is theoretical, and also Traleg Rinpoche talks about this because it's very often we operate with generalizing. This particular approach here is very much about us practicing. It's very much about us practicing meditation and experiencing what we're talking about. I'm probably stating the obvious, but it has to be said. So, all right. So we've looked at different times. We've looked at this thing we call analytical meditation. Now, analytical meditation is the place where we go in, and as soon as you begin to question something, you always find out it's complex. You know, we sometimes say you can't see the forest for the trees. And as soon as we begin to look at something, we begin to see that it's made up of many different conditions. And that actually shows us that Phenomena don't exist just in one way. They are many different things depending on how we see it. So the way that we label our world and see our world, of course, is obviously the labels that we're saying. We'll say tree, we'll say woman, we'll say, you know, table, car, you know, ocean, sky. All these phenomena that we have, they have particular names. But the thing about any phenomenon, if we go in and look at them, can we find the essence of the tree in a tree? Can we find the essence of a particular person? No, they're really just constructs. And when we understand that there's nothing really there apart from just there's some conditions that have come together and we label it in a particular way, there's no basis for saying there's some absolute woman, there's some absolute tree, there's some absolute table. There's not. What we have are, we have some labels. If I was a horse and I came and looked at this table, I wouldn't necessarily think table, you know, or then there's tables, then you have desks, then you have coffee tables, all these things, right? If we're ants, horses, whatever, we don't think like that. Now, the point really here with analytical meditation is not just that we agree that we have different language games about things, but it's more that actually we see that there actually is nothing in phenomena apart from the labels that we give them. So in understanding that things are there in terms of our function, in terms of our conventional shared viewpoint, yes, definitely, but we won't find anything in the object itself that possesses any kind of essence. Now, it's a given. We're not saying there's no table, there's no whatever. So we agree. We rely on these labels. We rely on all the ways that we speak about it, the language practice, and so on. And it's not as if there's a problem with saying that a table is a table, or a woman or a man is a man, and so on. But the only thing is, so that's fine. But the thing is, we actually wouldn't think of there being an essential table, an essential man, an essential woman. So that's where we would say that, and Traleg Kyabgon's point is, it's not as if there's a problem with this language, but we also shouldn't naively just think, it's really there. Now, this we're going to be visiting quite a bit in this particular chapter, and it really constitutes what we call the two truths. One is that there's a conventional reality that's just fine, unanalyzed, if you like. The other one is if we apply analysis, then we actually discover there's nothing that we can grasp. And it's when we begin to understand that we have less clinging and less fixation. If your kid comes and tells you that this is, the kid builds a castle and said, this is, Mont Saint-Michel, or this is some great castle or mansion or whatever, we say, yeah, that's fine. But we're not going to really think that it is other than just a labeled phenomenon. And that's where we understand the two truths. The Buddha is never going to contradict us in one way or another. In the Sutra of Meeting of Father and Child, where the Buddha went back to see his father, then the Buddha actually speaks to his dad and he says, it's not as if I disagree with anything that worldly people say in terms of just how they're labeled. But the problem lies in when we begin to apply the belief that these phenomena absolutely exist in one way or another. So Traleg Kyabgon says, thus we can see linguistic usage as a relative and conventional practice. We do not need to see language as describing reality perfectly in an absolute sense. It does not represent reality on an absolute level, but rather it is helpful on a practical level for daily situations. So likewise, the sage will agree, whatever people will say, but also would not be deceived by thinking there's some absolute reality in it. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm not going to ask questions because I'm at work. We'll email them after the session. Oh dear, it's always a lot easier for me to answer them here than answer emails. Okay, as long as you're patient. Okay. So, now such insight, this insight that we have that understands that phenomena, they appear, yet they have no reality, this is actually something that we deepen through what we call meditation on emptiness. Now, meditation on emptiness very often is thought of as something incredibly profound and deep. Well, it's not really. If you have children and if you have any kind of interaction with other people, you will right away see that we all see things differently. And that means that the object we're talking about doesn't exist in one solid way or another. We're already meditating on emptiness when we agree on that. The moment that we understand that phenomena are only labeled relative and perceived relative to who's seeing it, perceiving it, then we actually understand emptiness. We're approaching that understanding. But what we do with meditation is that we begin to actually settle into an insight. That's where we begin to recognize that this is something that counteracts a disease. And that disease is our judgmental, rigid, labeling mind that sticks to it, insisting that how I see it is the right way. We know this from discussions, how people can get rigid and ridiculous. And we can get rigid and ridiculous. But so that's why we recognize that we attribute any given phenomenon. I'm sitting looking at a plant. Actually, the way that I'm labeling this is fine, but I'm failing actually to recognize the lack of inherent existence. And that's where the degree to which I deepen this insight, to that extent, I begin to free up the mind. So such kind of, and we operate when we're talking about this kind of meditation on emptiness. One is analytical meditation, one is settling meditation. And here we're mainly talking about analytical meditation. Now this, we might think of it as an intellectual or sort of abstract practice. And we very often hear meditation on emptiness described in rather philosophical abstract terms. But it's something that actually has a lot of significance on what we are experiencing in our everyday life. It relates directly to our everyday life. So we are much better off when we have that open-mindedness. You know, there's two people saying two different things, you know, about the same thing, and you kind of know how they both end up. It's true from each their particular angle, right? So so this is where it's something that's very helpful for us in our ordinary existence. And of course, it is also what ultimately leads us to free the mind altogether. So it's important that us who are exposed to this, then we apply it. We need to engage in understanding of the insubstantiality of the world, meaning of our perceptions, what we experience. So we shouldn't think, oh, emptiness, I could never understand this. This is so deep and so big, and you know, there's all those big words in there and so on. That's possibly sometimes have to use philosophical terms because they generally they happen to have more universal application. So it tends to be abstract, but that's really just because they have a wider purpose. But we can illustrate all of this with specific examples. So that's what I'm doing when I'm saying, for example, we have a kid who's saying this sandcastle is so and so real, or when we have friends that each say something different, but we kind of agree with both of them. But it's something that's important that we realize this understanding of emptiness, the lack of inherent existence or the lack of solidity, it's not something that sort of comes at a later stage. There are indeed some big books called Emptiness and stuff like that. There's a lot to be said about this because it really is important. But at the same time, it's something that we need to apply right now, right here, you know. Traleg just says, deepening the understanding of shunyata, or emptiness, can also have the effect of eroding our tendency to grasp, cling, and be fixated on things. This allows us to engage with our sensory experiences in a much freer and more liberated and liberating way. We have developed a sense of openness to sensory experiences so that we have a broader and more inclusive experience. Okay. So essentially, in terms of thinking about the path, understanding of emptiness, shunyata, frees us from fixation. So it's something that has immediate value, immediate application. Now, this is not just about us gaining insight into some mystical dimension. Like I said, it's about us beginning to have a more easy relationship with the world, and we develop an openness to our experiences. It means that we're not involved in this rather uptight, rigid practice of censoring our experiences. What signifies one of the great sort of delights about a sage is that the sage is very easygoing, is very unjudgmental, is very cool with regards to whatever happens. And that's the difference between a sage and, let's just say, a very strict religious person. We could have a very virtuous and wonderful religious person, and by all means, that's very good. But what really signifies a sage, someone who has the experience of shunyata, is this openness to whatever there is. And it actually comes with a lot more insight with regards to things. It also comes with a lot more sense of humor because we're not stuck on anything particular. So essentially what we're talking about here is a greater openness with regards to the world, connecting more with the world. Traleg Rinpoche's point is that with less grasping, then we enjoy things more and we experience things more fully. So this is where we shouldn't think emptiness or meditation on emptiness is about us going into sort of the wilderness and you know, we go into some incredibly deep experience. That could help, not to deny that can be extremely helpful, but what really the implication is that we're opening up to the world. We're actually being much more engaged and also enjoying the world much more fully. Rinpoche says the concept of emptiness is not something that we have to understand at the expense of our attention to sensory objects, the phenomenal appearances of tables, chairs, and so forth. The emptiness is embodied in the object, be it table, chair, or anything else. Now, I'd like to say that is a very significant way of phrasing this, what we have in the Heart Sutra, we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form, to say the emptiness is embodied in the object. That means that emptiness is found in the table. The real nature of the table is emptiness. And yet its appearance, its label table, is valid conventionally. So this emptiness is not something that exists apart from the table. And while that sometimes constitutes a little bit of a conundrum, potentially a paradox, sometimes when we hear about it first time, I think the term embodied in the object is a very elegant way of phrasing it. Somebody's asking if I've joined the circus, what's hanging behind you? Actually, I chose to come down to some friend's place because the internet is better down here. I've had some internet issues, and I'm at some friend's place. This is their kid's room. The kid left home. I don't know what the kid used to do in that thing there. Maybe exercise, I guess, you know. Anyway, that's a little bit off topic, I'd say. Let's keep the questions topical. Okay. Okay. Anyway, emptiness of trapeze. There you go. All right. So openness and lightness brings the insight of emptiness. And again, this comes back to what we're talking about in terms of the experience of this. This is not something that has to do with excluding the world. It's about embracing the world. And the point is the reality that we're aspiring to see. Seeing truth. The truth will set you free. And what we're doing on the path is looking for reality. We're looking to see reality properly. We're looking to see the truth. And it's not as if the appearances are going to get in the way. Appearances, there's nothing wrong with the appearances. But the problem is not the appearances, but the thing is our delusion. That's where we fail to see phenomena. Like we had this quote from Tilopa, where he says to his student Naropa, Naropa, you're not deceived by the appearances, you're deceived by your clinging. And we famously have the Heart Sutra where we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is no other than form. And that is something we carry with us throughout the Mahayana, and also it's basic to the Vajrayana understanding of mandala and deity. The moment that we're seeing reality in forms of mandala and deity, that is where we are beginning to see things as seeing that for what they actually are, seeing the luminous quality of things without the overlay of our projections. And that's where we see the world as a mandala, we see ourselves as deity. And that is seeing ourselves without the confused overlay, and actually seeing ourselves, the form, as being embodying reality, and that's deity. And yet it's also something that has nothing concrete about it. So the nature is emptiness, and yet that emptiness is also appearing. So when we have the Heart Sutra often chanted in the various lineages and traditions, certainly all across Tibetan Buddhism, we always chant this because it brings us home to this insubstantial yet vivid nature of our reality. Traleg Kyabgon says, if our delusions are reduced through greater awareness, through the greater practice of mindfulness and greater understanding, we will continue to have the experience of appearance, but appearance will be perceived as not being separate from reality. Reality being emptiness, that is, appearance and emptiness together. So that's something that we always, Tongsi Khyentse Rinpoche will so often say, don't divorce emptiness and appearance. That's of course what we do, but we're looking at how to actually practically, reunite the two. Emptiness is embodied in form, so that includes all thought then, including the bardo. Yes, there's not a single phenomenon that is not empty. And yet there's not a single phenomenon that in being empty is not manifest. So the point is that we don't want to be caught on appearances. We want to be able to see the reality of phenomena, whether it's the bardo or thoughts or whatever. So this is where we go wrong. We as sentient beings, we mistakenly grasp onto only one aspect of what appears, mainly the surface. We fail to recognize that this is just a construct. Of course, if we were to go into it, you burrow into a given phenomenon, it's made up of particles and so forth, then we understand that it's made up of so many different things. But at the same time, also as that it has no intrinsic reality, then also it appears. It is still, this is still a hand. The plant next to me is still the plant. The trapeze is still the trapeze. And so we understand that the ultimate truth and relative truth are not separate. So when we grasp, when we as sentient beings fixate on things, that's good, that's bad, this is mine, somebody scratches our car, we come back to the car in the parking lot. There's a big scratch in it. That's where we begin to say, that's my car, or whatever it might be. And all the things that we grasp, this of course is just a small, silly thing, but there's all the time phenomena that we fixate on and we're dependent on. So, sometimes reality is eroded from under our feet, and that's where we realize that we've been investing our belief in phenomena that actually they're actually by nature, they're impermanent. They don't have reality. And that's where we as sentient, ordinary, confused persons, when we grasp, we miss ultimate truth and we misperceive the relative truth. This is such an important point. It's being repeated here a fair few times, but it is really, really significant. And also what Nagarjuna says, emptiness is dependent arising, and dependent arising also is emptiness. And what we mean with that, emptiness is that which is conditioned, and that which is conditioned is also emptiness. Something that's dependent doesn't exist in its own right. Like Elizabeth Mathis Namgyal says, it leans, it's dependent. So what we call, let's say, well, I'm thinking of Elizabeth, I'm saying this is a roof, right? Is that one or two things? Well, it's both one and two. There's these two things, but at the same time also it creates a particular shape, like a roof. If we look at a roof, it's made out of countless things, rafters. Now, by the way, when we talk about this notion of dependent arising and emptiness, this is also something that of course, we could identify different views in regards to how we understand dependent arising and emptiness. But at the same time, there's no real need to sort of get involved in that kind of squabbling. And again, it's relative just to how we see things. So we needn't actually see that there's a big divide in what Traleg Kyabgon called earlier and later Buddhism, what we sometimes call the Theravadan and the Mahayana traditions. They're based on the same teachings of the Buddha. There's not a big divide, really. Traleg Kyabgon says the one additional thing that one has to do is to go beyond even that understanding, the understanding of the non-separability of relative truth and absolute truth. Through meditation, eventually, one realizes the non-separability of emptiness and reality. That emptiness and phenomenal appearance are not separable. So this is where we then engage this issue with, this is not just enough that we understand this, we need to practice meditation. Okay, so now we have some questions. I wonder how this teaching applies to the suffering of the loss of close loved ones. I wonder how the Buddhists would deal with the situation of, if, for instance, they see their own parents or sons die in an unfortunate way, like in an accident. Well, I don't think we should think that all of a sudden the Buddha is like, oh, I'm so above it all, my son just died and it's all just emptiness. No, not at all. Of course, the Buddha would understand the reality of it, but at the same time also be profoundly empathetic to the person for whom this is experienced, and also the person that's undergoing the death and so forth. So, as we often come back to, the expression of enlightenment is compassion. So there will never ever be a moment where this understanding will lead to some sort of closed, how do you say, some sort of sanitized, cold, detached attitude. Not at all. On the contrary, this opens up for a very soft heart. And that's why we define the Bodhisattva as somebody with literally bleeding heart, very raw and very, very unafraid to be open to the pain of the world. Then there's a question, ultimate truth and relative truth are not separate, and yet I hear in the teachings that we cannot use the logic of relative truth to refer to the ultimate truth. Seems paradoxical. Look, we sometimes would say absolute truth is beyond any kind of logic whatsoever. That's true. But at the same time, we can also use relative logic by, if the moment that we begin to analyze, let's say you know somebody, right? Let's say somebody you're close to, and somebody says, is this person good or bad? Because you know them well, you can't say, oh, they're good, they're bad. You don't say, well, there are many different things, unless you're in a bad mood. You say, yeah, bastard, or in a good mood, wonderful person. But the reality is, people are complex, and the things that we very often label good or bad, if we just look, they're actually neither good nor bad, and that is relative logic. And that actually takes us through to understanding emptiness. So we can use relative logic to, you could say, dismantle the truth of the relative appearances. But of course, the absolute truth itself is more, like Traleg Kyabgon is also saying, it's more than just, you could say, something that's intelligent. It's a free experience. And so we use logic to free us. And of course, the ultimate truth is something that's beyond the ordinary, you could say, ordinary intellect or ordinary mind, right? So yes. And the logic of inference then is suitable for reference to the ultimate truth, as is the finger pointing to the moon. Is it okay to put it so? Yeah, we can say that. We can say in that thing, phenomena lack inherent existence. Their nature is emptiness. And yet we have to remember that word emptiness there is just really a place marker for the actual experience. But yes, so that's where inferential logic, yes, is valid in this case. For those of you who study Madhyamika, what I've been talking about here is the two kinds of absolute reality. One is what we call the enumerated absolute, and the other is the non-enumerated absolute. The enumerated absolute is when we logically can assess and establish emptiness. The non-enumerated absolute is the actual experience. So that's, again, it's valid, that finger that points to the moon, that's the enumerated absolute. The actual moon, the actual liberation, is the non-enumerated absolute. So, important point, we should neither fixate on appearances, nor should we fixate on emptiness. Obviously, we as sentient beings, we fixate on appearances, but that's where we go wrong. This is where we're addressing that. But we should also not fall into fixating on emptiness. Fixating on emptiness is a big problem and would lead to nihilism and distortion. And this is what we sometimes have in a modern context, in postmodern philosophy, in the post-truth era, and so forth. We end up forgetting the sort of conventional reality. We're so in love with this discovery that there is no, foundation for any notion of truth. There's no truth with a capital T. We fall so in love with that we fall into missing the point about the reality that we live within, which is very much based on cause and effect, and where what we do really makes a big difference. And also it leads us also to completely ignore the way that our consciousness operates. So this is where this lack of inherent existence potentially could go wrong. And Nagarjuna famously tells us, if we grasp this view wrongly, if we get it wrong, it's like grasping a poisonous snake wrong. I remember the first time I came to Australia, I came to Vajradhara Gompa, and there was this friend of ours, friend of the Gompa, who he came up, and there was this red-bellied black snake, and he just sort of picked it up and sort of dropped it in a bag, and off he went with it. So if you know how to grasp the poisonous snake, yes, but if you don't, this can go very wrong. So in terms of this process, then, we first overcome negativity with positive remedies. That means we first begin to identify problems with our anger, our fixation, our greed, jealousy, and all of that. We begin to work with that, and we try to become, you could say, better persons that is free of that. And yet, eventually we need to, even though we might, be a lot calmer, we still need to go, and this we'll look at in the Abhidharma section, we need to go beyond all reference points altogether. We need to be, not just be, otherwise we say it's a bit like replacing an iron cage for a golden cage. So when we are practicing a virtuous condition of mind, that's very helpful. We're a lot freer, but we're still not ultimately free. That's why ultimately we have to go beyond reference points altogether. But this is a very real project. This is not a philosophical project. And that's where we have a path where we need to progress from profound understanding to actual realization. So that's why there's a big difference between somebody who's both learned but also very virtuous, and then those that actually really have realization, who really are free. And when someone is free, when there's realization, then the way that they understand the world and the way that they engage with the world and what is known and the person knowing it and so forth cease to be two. That's where we talk about non-duality. And that's where the Buddha is at ease, is at rest. There's not this me and the object. Traleg Kyabgon says, when true realization is attained, the object known does not remain something separate, even on a very subtle level. What is to be known and the knower become merged, without a cognitive break between object known and the knower, the subject. Okay? Non-duality. And this then is basic to the tantric vehicle, where we exactly I was mentioning before, in the tantric vehicle, the vision that we're engaging, the unity of appearance and emptiness, that's basic to the notion of the mandala, deity, and so forth, is this non-duality. You could say tantric, when we talk about tantric mandalas, tantric visualization, and also tantric ritual and whatever, tantric yoga, it's all about basically engaging in the wisdom of the unity of appearance and emptiness. And in here then, within that condition, then there's not the afflicted condition between self and object. There's not the self that's struggling to get what we want or keep at bay what we don't want. The kleshas are dissolved into this equanimity or non-duality. So we understand that what we're aiming at in the tantric vehicle and in all the vehicles really is not renouncing desire. It's not about that. It's about being intelligent about the desire. And in doing that, desire, as much as we're not, you could say, suppressing it or kicking it out and so forth, it also doesn't mean that we're endorsing it. Desire is never perpetuated. The value of all the various different jhanas, all the different vehicles of Buddhism, is that desire needs to be transformed. That's a basic. It doesn't matter if we are Mahasiddha and displaying all sorts of strange behaviors. There's the Mahasiddha is a Mahasiddha due to actually having transformed desire and being as pure as a pure monk. So in mantra, we address this through the purification of perception, and that is where we operate with the development stage practice, in which we then have the deity arising and also dissolving at the end. So we have the view that recognizes the purity of phenomena, and yet we also purify the actual process in which we experience coming into being and then dissolving. So that goes for ourselves, it goes for any given phenomena. And that's why in the development stage practice, we engage with phenomena, yet with that particular view of a unity of appearance and emptiness. So when we in Vajrayana do deity yoga, this achieves a greater degree of shamatha and vipassana. So initially we settle the mind, and we do this not through just settling it on the breath, but actually settling into this wide vision that is the perception of phenomena as mandala and deity. And then we cultivate that further in a greater understanding of vipassana and integrating that in the practice. And then finally, we relinquish any reference point whatsoever, which is then what we call the completion stage. So after the development stage, which is where we develop shamatha and vipassana, then we settle into the completion stage, which is beyond any reference point. So we have these three stages. Traleg Kyabgon describes it here: stabilizing the mind, gaining the right view, and then going beyond the right view. And he says, whenever we do tantric practice, we do those three things. First, we stabilize the mind. Second, we develop insight into the appearance of the deity as arising and ceasing. And third, at the end of the practice session, we remain in the natural state without entertaining thought. In Mahamudra and Dzogchen teachings also, similar methods are used. So in case you had any doubt, to overcome fixation, we need the right view of dependent arising. And we need to apply this on our fixation in terms of focusing on our self, a sense of self, and then we analyze me. It's not something unitary, it's complex. I remember reading in Jeffrey Hopkins' Meditation on Emptiness, which is one of these great classic bricks on the topic, emptiness. In there, he describes how in the Gelug tradition, they have a very skillful way of actually conducting classes on the emptiness, and particularly then the emptiness of self, is that the teacher will come in and then start by freaking one of the students out. I don't know if it would go down nowadays in sort of our delicate modern educational system, but the teacher would say to one of the students, like, I know you've stolen 100 rupees from me. You know, I know you took my 100 rupees. I know it's you. And the student right away will have a very keen sense of self. You know, when we're put on the spot, you know, imagine you're, public speaking. You know, there you are on the stage, and you have to talk to, a lot of people, or whatever it might be. We have moments where there's a very keen sense of self. And it's on the basis of having a keen sense of that self. It's not just a philosophical project. When we should do this, we should try to think of a moment at least where we're uncomfortable and there's this clear sense of me. The issue is not what happened, but it's about the clear sense of me. And that's what we're going to analyze. And we say, hey, there's a me. Isn't it funny? Because I'm in fact both a body and a mind. I'm so many different things in my consciousness. I'm so many different things in my body. So that's where we see that thing that we call me is not a unit. It's something that's made up of conditions. It's complex. And that complexity, what we call dependent arising, is merely labeled me. There is no unitary self. There's no unit, essential self. And that also applies to phenomena. External phenomena also do not possess a self. So those of you who've been through classes in Madhyamika, that's the point. Might be a lot of arguments that are intended to sort of dismantle some of the other Indian philosophical schools at the time of Chandrakirti or Nagarjuna. But the basic bottom line is that we want to show that there's nothing we can grasp, neither in the subjective dimension nor in the objective dimension. So once we get that down, then it's about us integrating that. We need to align ourselves with the right view, and we do that through the practice of meditation. The thing that very often happens, and this is not just hippies or, complete amateurs, but it's something that's almost embedded in some cultural practices, and it was sort of very rampant also at the time of the Beats exposure to Japanese Zen Buddhism and so on. There's a whole thing of like, well, we have wrong view, we're doing the wrong thing. We should really have no view whatsoever. We should be free of dogma. We should, la-di-da, And that's not going to work either, because this is not intellectual exercises. This is about experience. And that's why we need to go from having a definite toxic view that sort of propels us into suffering and confusion, into then beginning to have actual experience of relief and happiness, which comes from right view and virtuous actions and so forth. And it's at that point then, once we have that stability in a greater freedom of mind, that we can then graduate to being free of any reference points. Traleg Kyabgon says, many people try to make the intellectual jump from wrong view to no view, declaring that all views are bad. So even the so-called correct views comes to be mistakenly seen as the wrong view, insofar as it is a view. Having thus decided we should not be attached to any view, we may then proclaim that we will have no views. This or that is not the Buddhist approach. The Buddhist way is, over time, to correct the wrong view with the right view. Hi. If to practice Mahamudra and Dzogchen, you can do it right away, or you have to do the Nundro first. Well, you have to do the Nundro first. It's Dzogchen essence Vipassana? Yes. Dzogchen is a kind of Vipassana. So everything we do in Buddhism leads to greater and wider perspective. So everything we're doing in Buddhism is ultimately towards gaining wisdom, gaining Vipassana. So the practice of Dzogchen, Mahamudra, and so on, they're very skillful ways, but they do require that we have the foundation like we're talking about here, right? For someone who has gone from wrong view to no view, how can someone help guide them back? It's difficult, you know. They might not be, if they've arrived at no view, they might not be open to anybody who challenges their particular idea. So it's only really, well, if you have a trust relationship and you can gently point to how the lack of view possibly is not really helping. So that's where we have to be skillful. Yeah, and a lot of questions are actually about how can we help other people. One good thing we can do is apply it to ourselves first, but then we might inspire others. Then they might come and ask us questions. But if we're just mainly applying the teachings and seeing others need to have things fixed, then we might not be that inspiring to them. They might perceive us as, you know, interfering in their journey. It's delicate. It's delicate. But definitely, if somebody is asking that question, then yes, studying a book like this, or any of the teachings you find, for example, from His Holiness the Dalai Lama or Tsongtse Rinpoche, Traleg Rinpoche, you know, all the great masters are very skillful in actually taking us through that progression. So as far as part one, the nature of desire goes, we're now concluding this. And what we've seen in this first part of the book is how the many forms of desire, they are only negative on the basis of our fixation. So all the various kinds of desires that we have, what really makes them toxic and difficult is when we are fixated, that we cling. That's the real problem. So as we learn to be free from clinging and fixation, the reality of this is we become more at ease in the world. So free of fixation, free of the ordinary kind of desire, we actually can enjoy the world much more. So we do this in terms of training in managing our emotions, and that's where we practice going from wrong view to correct view, and ultimately freeing us from views altogether. We train in this. This is a journey, and what we're doing effectively, even right from the word go, right from the start, is that we're discontinuing this abuse of our natural intelligence, our natural brilliance. Our mind naturally is expansive, but yet it's gone into a small place. And right from as soon as we start practicing, we're already beginning to open it. So there's so many different kinds of desire that are destructive. There's greed, but even just also our desire perhaps to hurt others or make a point, you know, and all these kind of acts of aggressions, they're also forms of desire. And so there are many kinds of desire that are destructive, but that does not mean that all desire is bad. It's more that we fixate, you know, we might be annoyed, but if we're not fixating on it, then it doesn't turn into something where we desire to hurt others. So the core of this, down at the bottom, lies this grasping and fixation. Now, for example, would see the Buddha is caring for sentient beings, Bodhisattvas caring for sentient beings, the sages caring for sentient beings. You could say, is that desire? Are they attached? No, it's not desire. But that's the nature of enlightenment, is actually to be there for others. It's a warmth that is a natural expression of awakening. So we could say the Buddha's compassion is one form of desire, a very good kind of desire. The Tibetan word Jesu Chakpa actually means to yearn for, or to be wanting to look after. So that's the Tibetan. That means actually it's actually caring, or it's an expression of compassion that means to hanker for or desire, but it implies compassion, compassionate caring for others. Traleg says, even if someone has attained the transcendental state of no view and has gone beyond grasping and fixation, that enlightened individual may still have desire, insofar as they have Buddha intentionality. Buddha intentionality should be understood as an expression of desire. So again, this is how we should understand the nature of enlightenment, which is this caring, this quality of compassion. Then somebody's asking me what I think about some Vipassana courses. Oh, that's not really relevant to what we're studying here. Yeah. And then there's can we say that this warmth, this compassionate caring for others, this enlightenment is symbolized by the sun rather than the moon? Well, the moon, I tell you, it really just symbolizes that in India, where it gets very hot, then at night when the moon comes up, it's sort of like seen as relief. So the moon image has more to do with what we call liberation. And I guess you could say the sun has more to do with, you say, enlightenment and so forth. But it's the same thing. Yeah. Okay. I'm also thinking about the sun and moon and the tigers. I see what you mean. Actually, the sun and moon and the tigers, well, that has more to do with what we call skillful means and wisdom. So yeah, you could say this, the moon of the, you could say the moon of wisdom and the sun of skillful means, or the sun of compassion. Yeah, that's valid actually. That's valid. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are now officially in part 2. And at this point, Abhidharma, the psychology of meditation, makes tremendous sense, because we are aware that we need to know what's going on with our mind, and this is where we are applying then the applied science of Buddhism is the psychology of meditation. We could even say the psychology of integration, because it's also about post-meditation. But that's where we apply this in the sense of something that is based on an insight and then applied. So here, chapter 10, many elements combine to create experience. This is where we're beginning to look at these things that we call mental events, the various occurrences in the mind. So in general, as practitioners, we may have some idea of how to handle grasping and fixation through what we've heard, and also through the practice of meditation. But we could very well be great meditators. We could have a lot of calm. We could have a lot of understanding, but we could still be stuck with some primitive assumptions about reality. Us who live in the materialist world, and I'm not talking about wanting cars and fancy gadgets, but to actually believe that consciousness is something that's created from material matters, to believe that our brain creates consciousness, to believe that when we die, then because our brain stops, then consciousness ends. For us, then, we very often have some, in this culture, there's a lot of assumptions about reality that actually come from a really distorted perspective that's very much tied up with grasping and fixation, very much on the basis of some pretty squeaky, you could say, unsubstantiated assumptions. So that's where we have a rather very successful, but also very confined materialist science. So that's where we actually need to go in, and certainly when it comes to our own mind, just to have a calm mind is not going to necessarily set us free. So here in part 2, we're going to explore the nature of experience and how to work with our experience constructively. In particular, then, this study will be in relation to the practice of meditation. This is us as practitioners who apply introspection, who know what's happening in our mind. Abhidharma is something that brings science, or it brings an insight. When we sit down and meditate, it's the Abhidharma is where we have some insights, and we're essentially providing a container of calm where this insight can become far greater. And so Abhidharma helps us to show the nature of our mind and the world. So this is where we're beginning to get a clear picture of our own mind and the world around us. Now, mindfulness is where we work with the mind. Awareness is the context of our perspective. So in general, with mindfulness, we have some wonderful results in terms of calming the mind. And awareness is then when we begin to have a realization or have some ease with regards to the world, that we're no longer deceived by the world. That's where this awareness gives us the greater understanding of our reality. My default is still becoming aware of when I shift from wrong view and aim more towards right view. Curious if no view is only something that can be pointed out by a master. It is very hard to get to authentic non-view without teacher-student relationship, if that makes sense. Yeah. It's definitely that we have to go towards right view. And the no view is more sort of when we're caught up in theory. You know, when people pick up a book on Dzogchen, then all of a sudden, you know, they'll say, oh, it's no good and bad and all of that, famously, right? So that's more where you could say it's more sort of an intellect, it's more intellectual, it's more an danger for this sort of intellectualizing, yeah? That's where the danger lies. Just relying on books. Traleg says, as for the distinction between mindfulness and awareness, mindfulness is not only seen as being a support to positive emotions or states of mind. Mindfulness is also developed as a way of becoming more conscious of the activities in the mind in relation to the range of interconnected mental events set out in the Abhidharma text. So we set out to deliberately cultivate mindfulness in terms of the variety of elements and events arising in the mind. Awareness, on the other hand, is seen as arising spontaneously as a result of successfully applying mindfulness in this way and over time, as a means of understanding the mind. So you could say mindfulness is the skillful means and awareness is the wisdom. So when we have the container of mindfulness, then this sort of knowledge that we have from studying the Abhidharma and knowledge we have of the mind, it's then something that enables our awareness to then emerge with a far greater confidence, a far greater perspective. So when we're studying the Abhidharma, we're going to see that our mind consists of many different things. It's not a one-shot deal, an essential mind. So Abhidharma shows us the constructed nature of the mind. And in studying the Abhidharma, we observe the elements that make up the mind and the mental events. how our mind is constructed, the skandhas and so forth, the 51 mental events and so on. So what appears to be a unitary mind turns out to be collections of mental events. And that's again how we very often, referring back to the image of the mala, we have what appears to be a mind, a mala, but yet it's made up of many different mental events. So when we are introduced, as we are being now, to the constructed nature of mind, then we begin to see that there's just various conditions that are influencing our choices and our actions, our impulses. And when we begin to see that, we're less controlled by it. So Abhidharma exposes the nature of the mind, and that then enables insight when we then apply this more through meditation. So just studying the Abhidharma gives us a lot of perspective, but it actually only really creates deep insight when we practice meditation. So for example, when we understand how the 6 consciousnesses works in terms of our various kinds of perceptions, then we also understand emotions. When we understand that, in fact, what is appearing to me as something that sparks off strong emotions, let's say a cup of tea, and I'm thirsty, and it's a really good rooibos rooibos tea. That creates a strong emotion in me. And that's actually my consciousness, thought, rooibos tea. Then there's the object that I'm smelling, that I'm seeing, and so forth. And that then generates this sense of attachment. But rather than it just being the impulse, clunk, then it's beginning to understand that there's a bunch of conditions here. So we're not so easily, you could say, dragged into action. We have perspective. Doesn't mean that we should starve ourselves or, not have the rooibos tea. So, but it enables us to understand the factors, mental events. Traleg Kyabgon says, through the practice of meditation, we learn how the primary mind is supported by the mental events, mental factors, or in Tibetan we say semjong. The sort of factors at work and which support the collection of the 6 sensory consciousnesses is what is called primary mind. And they determine whether we experience negative emotions like anger or jealousy, for example, or whether we experience positive emotions. The practice of meditation then is performed in order to work with the mental events so that we can transform ourselves. I have to make a humble admission here. There might actually, if there's any of Traleg Kyabgon's students out there that maybe have more information on this, I'm not entirely clear on what Traleg Kyabgon means when he talks about primary and secondary mind. I mean, I'm reading what he says here, and I've looked at it, but still it's a little bit vague for me. So I'm asking you, please don't ask me questions just about that. And if some of you understand it clearly, perhaps, some of Traleg Kyabgon's students, if Rinpoche has taught it elsewhere, or maybe you have a clear understanding, I'd be very grateful to hear what you have to say. Okay. So meditation is not about overcoming emotions. It's not about just that, but about understanding and freeing the mind. So it's all very good that we're calm and all of that, but that's not really the point. It's about understanding and freeing the mind from the root. So there's 2 kinds of experiences. We have negative mental events that create negative emotions. And then positive mental events that create positive emotions. So we might have, for example, anger at somebody, and then that creates a sort of abiding resentment. We might have somebody extending themselves generously to us, and we feel gratitude. So within these kind of situations, then we have defiled positive emotions and undefiled positive emotions. So this gratitude that's conditioned, we would say, is defiled positive emotions. But undefiled positive emotions would be just a general unconditional quality of gratitude that's not necessarily based on interaction with a particular object. It will more just be an expression of the nature of the undefiled or unconfused mind. And that's where we then talk about Sakme in Tibetan, or undefiled positive emotions. So the mental events are often positive and negative mixed, as we know. We might be angry at somebody, but then this might be our lover or our child or our parent and so on. So it's sort of a mixed bag, And in general, when we're working with the mind, we're gradually eliminating dualistic, defiled condition, gradually realizing non-duality, undefiled, then of course it's a mixed. We would say on the journey from samsara to nirvana, on that path, then defiled and undefiled is mixed. Traleg Kyabgon says, some of the negative mental factors that support negative emotions include being resentful, become some of these mental events, while others may continue to occur without being worked with or reduced. So we might, for example, reduce our resentment, but then again, we might still be miserly. So it's about not us only sort of being, it's continually actually being able to work at a place that so the antidote is something that permeates all the different conditions. It's not just that we get rid of one, but we need to get rid of what is basic to all of them. But we do so also working with one and then working with another. So we're continually, as we know, practically speaking, we have, certainly myself, such a rich array of kleshas, toxic emotions, that there's always something to work on. So we might develop one positive mental event, yet unable to reduce another. So we want to work with the underlying structure that promotes the negative emotions. So that is where what we ideally are working with is undermining the notion of self. But then again, until we've actually properly, completely freed the notion of self, which of course would dissolve all positive mental events, we could also just practice patience, or we could practice the underlying structure that promotes these negative emotions, in the sense that we could begin to eliminate the sort of the common ground of all these negative impulses. So, but we need to be real, and we need to actually work with the actual individual elements. And it's once we begin to see that we can actually dissolve these, then we begin to also have some confidence. So we begin with seeing through this assumption of essential solidity, that we think, I'm ruled by my anger. But the moment that we actually are able to be patient, we begin to not be driven by the anger. We begin to even have some sense of ease within the midst of the anger, not being even pushed by it in any way. That's where we begin to see through this assumption we have that this is what I am, or this is my anger. So in meditation, this is where we train letting go of the various mental events. So these sort of various events, they take place really between our physical and mental conditions. Like we have physical conditions, we might be tired, we might be rested, we might be hungry, we might be feeling great. And this also has an impact on our mental condition. And then also the subjective and objective phenomena ourselves in relation to things out there, or that can mean things, people, environment, and however. So we are continually in a condition of being constructed due to various conditions, outer and inner. So Traleg Kyabgon says, to reiterate, in understanding emotions, we have to recognize the various elements of our mental life and physical experience. Our mental life is supported by these elements, meaning these mental events. Without understanding them, we will not be able to understand our mind so well. Transforming our mind is not simply about transforming just one thing. It has to do with transforming the various elements. That is considered to be the approach that brings about final or full transformation. So, of course, we operate with some universal methods, the practice of meditation, the practice of awareness, and so forth. But at the same time, we also need to actually work with all the different elements, all the different mental events that happen. So paying attention to the various elements here refers to then the different kinds of mental experiences we have. It might be faith, it might be negative states of mind like resentment or anger, and so forth. There's so many different kinds of mental events that we talk about, and we begin to recognize them just through having heard about these: anger, desire, greed, whatever. We hear about them, we understand the problem, but we need to do more than just understand this. It doesn't help to just sit around and think about this, the problem with me, or the problem with these things. We actually need to also clean it up, and that's where we need to practice meditation. And that's where then this perspective expands. So we will increasingly be able to deal with mental events, also beyond our meditation, in our post-meditation. So there's three aspects to this, what we generally refer to as the kind of prajnas. We learn the elements, we learn what the elements are through study. So that's studying. We apply this insight in contemplation and meditation. So this is where we begin to think, how does this actually apply to me? And that's also where we contemplate in the practice of meditation. And then we begin to integrate this, both through meditation, but also post-meditation. So we recognize the occurrence of these teachings in post-meditation, meaning that it has an impact on us. It has an impact in terms of our experience, not just when we're sitting, but also in post-meditation, in ordinary life. So Traleg says, the Buddhist approach to transforming the mind has three aspects. First, we try to learn what the elements are by reading and listening to appropriate teachings. Secondly, we meditate and reflect on such teachings. And thirdly, in post-meditation situations, we try to think about these teachings so that we become more conscious in meditation. There's questions here. Somehow I find it challenging to let go of resentfulness to external phenomena, such as imposed restrictions, even though I sit and pay attention to the discomfort of resentment. Yes, it's difficult, challenging. That's it. That's the nature of the path. This is because we're doing something that's real, so it has to be challenging. If it wasn't challenging, then we wouldn't need to practice. We're practitioners, we're not experts, and presently it's challenging. Then again, we wouldn't want to not be doing this, otherwise we'd just be running with any impulse, then we'd get into trouble. Does that make sense? I think so, yeah. My understanding is probably similar to your guess, that the primary and secondary minds and primary and secondary negative emotions is the more basic. So anger might be a primary negative emotion, but resentment might be an example of a secondary, slightly more subtle. Similarly, the six sensory consciousnesses are very basic and therefore primary before we have begun to elaborate and create opinions and judgments, the secondary mind. I don't think this helps, but that is very helpful. And that's also a little bit what I was thinking also. Yes, we talk about a proliferation. So we first have the basic anger, and that develops into, that's true, that's true, that's very basic to the, when we have the 51 mental events, they're grouped into 6 different groups, and all of these have primary and then secondary. That's right, I think you're right. And also with the consciousnesses, then also the what comes from consciousness in terms of experience. Thank you, that's very helpful. And that's also very helpful for the group. Yeah, thank you. And then in regards to the challenge of sitting with the imposed restrictions, this person says, haha, yes, if not for meditation, I would be running amok. Okay, good. That's good. It's a community service. So we talk about, and this is coming to these mental events, there's what we call the kundronga, and these are then intentionality, the ever-present 5. So this is something that's present in all situations and experience. Intentionality, sempa or chetana, the object of the emotion. So that's the plant here. I'm sitting looking at the plant. I think beautiful plant. And then there's cognition, dushe or samjna, jana, the appraisal of the situation, knowing me sitting, adoring, admiring the plant. Feeling, sorwa, vedana, pleasure, pain, or neutral. Well, I'm very full of pleasure seeing such a nice plant. And then contact, the contact rekpa or sparsha, the contact between consciousness and object. Well, that's me seeing it. And then ideation, yila cheba or manasikara, conceiving what is happening. Again, this sense of there's plant there. Wonderful. Yeah. So Traleg says, each factor and event can be present in varying degrees of strength. So when the causes and conditions come together, they can manifest in a multitude of ways. Recognizing that these 5 mental factors or events need to arise together gives us some insight into how and why it is that we have an experience. Can we find these 51 mental events somewhere? Yes, there's a book called The Mind in Buddhist Psychology, which is a work by somebody called Leschly and Dr. Herbert Günther. And also there's Stephen Goodman's recently published book called The Buddhist Psychology of Awakening. In fact, we see them many different places, but I'm talking about places where they're explained. And there's some other places too. There's some, yeah, but yes, that's 2 places you can begin. Why is it called intentionality? It's because the mind is intent on it. There's an engagement with it. So the Tibetan word sempa actually means to think about it. So it's not just that we see something, but we actually begin to develop, an attitude about it. I was hoping you wouldn't ask this question. I was actually, just before I came here, I was thinking I need to read up on this one. And there is actually I found Stephen Goodman in his book. I didn't get to read it. He describes what is the difference between cognition and ideation. Yeah. So let's just have a look. But there's probably the appraisal of the situation and the ideation, conceiving what's happening. Very similar. Dushe, let me just say what dushe means, attitude. And so dushe is, or perception. And that's the general understanding of what's happening. I'm sitting, seeing the plant. And the Yila Cheba is just the more naked sense of there is something, there is the plant, there is the object that's there. But okay, very glad that you caught me on that one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that section in Stephen Goodman's explanation, and I'll upload that so you have that. Yeah. So is there a crossover between intentionality and cognition? Okay, guys, thank you for asking these questions. And what I'm going to do is I'll upload the information. Yeah. And then there's great, thank you. From memory, I recall the consciousness being referred to as a primary mind and the mental events or samskaras as secondary mind. And they always arise together. Okay, that's a bit like what we were saying before. Thank you. Perhaps some reference to the primary and secondary mind. No. These ever-present five, no, they operate in a different, they operate alongside each other, I think. Yeah. Good. With emotions like sexual desire, should we try to repress it, go ahead with them, or try to examine the nature of the emotion? Gosh, I almost want to tell you, what do you think, right? We're clearly not talking about repression. We're not talking about acting out. Yes, we are trying to examine the nature of emotion, and that's the point. We can deal with it one way or another, but what we're really trying to do is understand what's happening here. I feel like examining the nature of emotion doesn't remove the desire completely, but it lessens the strength somehow. Yes, and I mean, the thing is, we're not going to be just all of a sudden everything's gone. It's more about us beginning to identify what's going on. So this is where it's helpful that we then can apply this analysis. For example, the ever-present five, we can see that these five are present within any kind of sexual desire. And in general, we operate with a sense of I, that we again have seen as complex. The object, which if we analyze also, we can see there's not any essence in it. So the more we begin to analyze, the more actually, it's not exactly that the emotion goes away, but it's more that we begin to experience the complexity of it. Yeah, it lessens the strength. But the point is not really lessening the strength either. It's more that we begin to see what it is. Then there's a question, would you say that physical desire is driven by emotional desire? What about the things like survival, physical desires? Well, same thing really, that they're all operating from the basic duality of self and what the self wants and doesn't want. So the self comes from, or the emotional desire comes from a sense of I. So that's the basic klesha. When we then have physical desire like libido and so forth, this is because we're karmically constructed on the basis of that. So our physical body, with its particular libido and its so-called physical desire, is very much constructed on the basis of our identity or our equipment as sentient beings, which are where we're essentially equipped with what we call kleshas and karma. The basic emotional pattern and also the habit that we've sort of ingrained ourselves with over many lifetimes. So that also applies to the survival, the physical desires. Of course, it doesn't mean that when we're free from the emotional of any kind of desire that all of a sudden we couldn't care less whether we survive or not. Of course, yes, we do. And in fact, we probably do it better. But the thing is, it's not involved with the distortion and the insanity that very often our you could say afflicted conditions bring us into. Okay. So while these conditions, and again we're talking about these five ever-present conditions, are present in our actions, they are not predestined. Meaning our actions, because these conditions are there, doesn't mean that they're going to be in a particular way. So we're never talking about predestinations. When we're studying the causes and conditions that lead to particular actions, it's not like we're trying to figure out it's bound, or say it's bound to happen in one way or another, because there's so many different causes that are there. So it can never be predestination. And yet, so while we are driven by these conditions, and there are a variety of causes, we're not predestined. But what happens is this drives habituation. And so the habituation is then where we have patterns. We begin to act in a particular way. And this comes again and again and again. So again, it applies that while we might be predisposed, we might have particular habits, these again can be overcome. Otherwise, why bother? We can work with our habits. We're not necessarily driven by them. And this is something we've looked at also earlier on. Traleg says, while recognizing the persistent and compelling nature of our negative emotions, it should be noted that they can be overcome if one works positively using willpower, as discussed in part 1, while acknowledging the various elements responsible for causing perpetuation of a particular negative response. Then that negative state of mind and the associated elements can be transformed. From a Buddhist point of view, negative habits are overcome or rendered benign, not simply through the use of willpower, but also through recognition and understanding. It's essential to keep this in mind. So also coming back to the kinds of desire we looked at before, sexual desire or desire to survive and so forth. These are not, well, let's just say sexual desire or whatever kind of addiction or negative habits we might have, right? This we can work with through willpower. And also, like Traleg was saying, also the positive inspiration, the joy of, you could say, succeeding. And particularly, that's what's the point here, through recognition and understanding, beginning to understand these impulses and how they're driven by a number of different conditions. And so that's where the recognition and understanding weakens the power that these impulses have over us. So this is not us struggling against the devil, but it's just us beginning to understand what drives our actions and being more free. So the point here is we need to understand, emphasis on understand, our emotions, both for our temporary and ultimate objective. So we might be aiming for enlightenment, but even just in ordinary life, then we're much better off when we're not driven by our toxic emotions. So this is where meditation is important, because it develops mental events that can promote calm and awareness. So when we are practicing meditation, there is focus. When there's focus, there's calm and awareness. And through the positive mental factors of calm and awareness, then we also begin to be able to apply this to other mental factors. So it's not just that we settle down into being calm and aware, but it's also that we begin to also be less held, but let's say our anger or our greed. So when we do this, we're less subject to negative mental factors. So this means we're more free. Calm states in and of themselves do not mean we have overcome pleasures such as anger. So we might be very calm, but that's also because there might not be any problem. You're sitting on a cushion, or you're in a peaceful place and so forth. You're in retreat and all of these wonderful conditions there. You are calm. But that doesn't, that we appear calm doesn't at all necessarily mean that we've dealt with anger. It's only really when the right conditions are there that we'll see how we're working. There's a famous story many of you have heard so many times, when a teacher, he was so grateful when people would bother him, because that enabled him to actually see how was he doing with his patience meditation. And when at one point he was invited to come to Tibet, he had heard the Tibetans were very easygoing, and that's why he says, this is no good. I need somebody who can test whether I'm still prone to anger. So he brought along this really obnoxious, he was called, we refer to him as the Bengali tea boy. He was this guy who would make tea, but he was really obnoxious and irritating. So a teacher didn't want to be without somebody like that. So he brought him along. And the Tibetans say he needn't have brought him along, because there was plenty of obnoxious, irritating Tibetans anyway. All right. So So the point here is that understanding the mind is essential to overcoming the negative states. So it's not about just not giving into particularly negative states, but it's about understanding overall the dynamics of the mind that gives rise to these negative states. And that's what we do in the Abhidharma. That's why the Abhidharma is so important. So Traleg says, if we do not understand the dharmas, meaning the mental, all the various kinds of mental events and so forth, if we do not understand the dharmas, the various elements that perpetuate our mental life are not even noticed. When we have more understanding, the dharmas become more obvious. They're easier to work with, and we have a better handle on what is occurring in our mind. Okay. So I think we're good. There's no questions. Okay. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom. Next time, please read chapters 11 and 12, piecing apart the human experience and compatibility between meditation practice and theory of mind. Thank you very much. And I'll be uploading something on the 5 ever-present factors. Thank you.